guys, welcome to another video. In this one I'm going to be talking about my soil, which is a topic I've been meaning to cover for a while now, and today is the day. So I'm going to say that I really don't want you to overthink it. There's just a couple basic principles that you want to stick to for your soil to be successful, and whether that be designing your own or maybe using my own here or some interpretation of it. So the first basic principle is drainage, and drainage is usually aided by adding a particle that is a little larger than your base soil. A larger particle size just helps to break it up a little bit. So in most store-bought mixes, it's usually perlite. That's a pretty common one that's used really all over the world. So that's a pretty common one. The second one is aeration, and aeration is essentially just the air particles that are in between the other particles, the other soil particles. Because something that a lot of people might not know is that roots actually need air as well. If roots don't get air, they'll die off and rot. So you don't want that. Aeration is very important. That's generally the fluffiness of a soil. Is generally how you can see or determine whether a soil is has enough aeration in it or not. It's a good way to tell. And then the third one is, I'm actually going to mix those together, but the third one is water retention and nutrient retention. These two topics go hand in hand quite a bit, because if it holds on to water, it'll generally hold on to a lot of nutrients. If it holds on to nutrients, it'll generally hold on to water pretty well as well. So that's something that is usually organic matter. Organic matter holds on to a lot of water, holds on to a lot of nutrients as well. It also has a lot of those two subjects in it as well. And something that I like to add, a little spoiler for the rest of the video, is my little ingredient here. We'll talk about that more in a second. So let's look at a couple extremes that you would find outside to kind of give you an idea of some of the extremes that you might come across. If you're an outdoor gardener, this would apply to you. You might have handled some of these things. If you only do indoor gardening, you'll still be familiar with some of these topics. But the first one is clay. Clay is a pretty common one, and if you apply those basic principles to that, drainage, clay doesn't really drain very well. Water generally will sit on top of the soil and not soak in very well, and even if it does soak in, it takes a while to really soak in through the soil. It just soaks too slowly to get down into the soil. And what also will happen at that point is that a lot of water will be around the roots, which will then rot your roots. So clay is kind of a tough one to garden in. The second principle here, if you would apply to that, is aeration. Well, clay doesn't have a lot of air in the soil around in between the particles, because essentially what clay is decomposed rock. And these particles are so small that it doesn't leave a lot of room for air. So clay, again, doesn't score very good in that department either. And the last one, which is the thing that clay does score pretty high in, is water retention and nutrient retention. It does hold on to a lot of water, and it oftentimes too much, and it also holds on to nutrients pretty well as well. And since it is decomposed rock, it actually has quite a few minerals in it. Mineral content isn't generally a problem in clay soils. They actually have a lot of that, because that's essentially what it started off as. It's just the rock, so it generally has a lot of minerals in it. So your macronutrients are going to be okay in clay. Now the other extreme is sand. Sand, if you were to apply these principles, drains very well. It just goes right through. The aeration is great. There's a lot of little sand particles. There's plenty of room there for air to be in between that, so that's great. Problem is that it doesn't hold on to water very well. You have to constantly re-water it. It doesn't hold on to water. and it also doesn't hold on to nutrients very well. Like, especially if you have a water-soluble nutrient, like potassium, for instance. Potassium will just drain right through. You have to constantly refertilize, constantly keep that going in the soil, and you're really just kind of washing it away every time. So sand can actually be more difficult in some ways. But the best part to both, that'll fix both, the key ingredient is organic matter. Organic matter holds on to nutrients, holds on to water. It helps build that good texture within the soil. It breaks up clay soils, and it helps give some water retention to sandy soils. If you combine these two, then you'll get the ideal soil, which is loam. So that's good for outdoors. Indoors, however, most people go for a soilless mix. And the definition of a soilless mix, or a definition of soil rather, is soil is usually organic matter, clay, sand, and silt. Well, none of these things really would be good in a container because you would get the problems that we just talked about. So soilless mixtures allow you to really tailor all these different things to the perfect, measurements. Hi, kitty. So with that out of the way, to kind of give you a bit of a breakdown of what a lot of soils are like, we're going to be talking about my soil now. And the first ingredient is going to be the base of your soil. The base of your soil is just the biggest component of your soil. So that's usually organic matter. Like, a lot of people use peat moss. I don't like to use peat moss very much. It's taken from bogs, which isn't ideal. I prefer to use something like coconut coir, which is actually better than peat moss. It holds on to water better. It doesn't repel water when it gets dry. That's one of the biggest complaints about peat moss, is that it just really rejects water when it gets dry. Coconut coir doesn't do that. It holds on to water very well. It has a neutral pH, whereas peat moss is acidic. And it also holds on to nutrients better than peat moss does. I prefer to use coconut coir instead of using peat moss. However, there is also another ingredient, and I can use these interchangeably, really. This is shredded up bark, not wood chips, bark. It doesn't hold up nitrogen like wood chips would. But this is already kind of like a soil-like structure, very fluffy already. But it's much more easy to come by, and it breaks down nicely. I'm really not too worried about the base of my soil because of what I'm adding in later. It all turns into worm castings because I add worms to my soil. They're kind of hidden in here. There's just a little sampler here. So I add a composting worm to my soil, and there's some websites will say that that's not good because they roam and they keep your soil too wet. I've not found any of these problems, and I've been doing this for at least 4 years now. I never have any of these issues you're adding. So personally, I like to add a European nightcrawler. A lot of people use red wigglers for their worm bins, but I use a European nightcrawler. These are just directly taken from my worm bin. So, and they stay within the soil very well, and they break down the soil to worm castings, and worm castings is one of the best soils that you can have. So I'm not too worried about the base because it's all going to be turned into worm castings at some point anyways. It also helps with fertilizing. I don't have to worry about fertilizing all that much. If I forget to fertilize, I still have these worms going through and breaking it all down. So then another ingredient that I add to kind of feed the worms, if you will, is coffee grounds. I get this from my own coffee maker, but I also get it from Starbucks. They give me big bags of it in one go, like big trash bags full. So that works really well for me to get a bunch of coffee grounds. I can add as much of that as I want, but it also acts as a grit for the worms to break it all down. Then on top of that, I have eggshells. I don't add eggshells for the calcium necessarily. It'll take years, 4+ years for these eggshells to break down. So it's really not a good thing to be adding if you need calcium in your soil. It's not the reason why I add it. I add it because I have it. It's going to go to waste otherwise. And it also, again, helps with the grit for the worms. They kind of eat it up, and then they just use it as their grit. And that's something that composting worms need. So at some point it'll turn into calcium and it'll feed my soil, but it will take a while. So I don't add it necessarily as a fertilizer, but more as something that will turn into a fertilizer at some point, but that benefits my worms in the meantime. Okay, so the one ingredient that I don't ever skimp on anything, and if you've watched my other videos, you'll probably already know what it is, but I like to really add charcoal or biochar if it's charged to my soils. Charcoal, or more specifically biochar, it soaks up water, nutrients. It's a bigger particle, so it helps with drainage, but it also holds on to the microbiology, so beneficial bacteria and fungus and things like that. It's just a great all-around soil amendment that'll last indefinitely, because it lasts hundreds if not thousands of years in the soil. So it's a one and done type of deal, and I really like that. It also helps to regulate the nutrients in the soil. You know, it holds on to nutrients and releases it when the plants need it. When they want it, they can just suck it up. It's kind of like a sponge almost. So I really like to add charcoal. Now, the amount that you want to add is anywhere from 10 to 20%. In my little setup here, I have it's about 15-16%. We'll get to that in a minute. If you want to charge your charcoal and turn it into biochar, you can use a lot of things. I personally like to use, this is worm peas, what it's often referred to as. It's from my worm bin. It is just when the worms eat up everything, there's always fluid that's excreted, and this is essentially what that is. But it's a great fertilizer. It's packed full of nutrients. So if you wanted to charge up your charcoal and turn it into biochar, really all you'd have to do is just add it to your charcoal here, and then just let this sit for a couple days, let it soak up, and then that charcoal will be biochar. Biochar is just a term for soaked up charcoal full of nutrients. That's really all it is. As far as particle size, this is maybe the biggest particle size I would go to. I wouldn't go too much bigger, but it's not that big a deal. You don't want it to be too big. It also depends on the container size that you're using. If you're using a smaller container, you don't want the particles to be too big. You know, just about the size of a pebble, I would say, and not much bigger than that. So, but they're also small, like that. You know, they range in sizes. And then there's also like the fine dust, charcoal dust, and that's all fine too. So as far as these measurements here, I have a little bit of a demonstration of what my soil roughly looks like. And each one of these containers is about 2 parts. So my charcoal here is 1 part. So I'm going to add my shredded up bark there with my coir. Mix this up. The shredded up bark is pretty dry, and the coconut coir I just made this morning, so that's pretty wet, which will balance it out a little bit. Okay, So then here we have just any little thing. I always end up adding more stuff to my soils, but this is coffee grounds. This resembles about half a part. And then you have another half part here, which is the eggshells. Okay. So we got 5 parts. This will be number 6. Now because of the drainage and the lack of aeration, the lack of water holding, nutrient capacity and all that stuff, is also the reason why you don't want to go outside and just grab your garden dirt. It generally is too heavy. It generally doesn't have the looseness that your plants are going to appreciate. So that's why you either get something in the store or you make your own. Oops, I got it everywhere. I prefer to make my own because I can really tailor all the different ingredients to it in it. Okay, so that's mixed pretty well. Okay, now I'm going to add the worms to it. Just leave those on the top. They'll find their way down in here. And sometimes when I have my soil sitting, I'll just bury a banana peel or I'll bury something that decomposes quickly into my soil, and then the worms will just come in and they'll eat it all up. This is one of the reasons I really don't have to maintain or manicure it so much. I don't have to worry about what's in there too much because I have these worms essentially constantly working to help better and make the soil, just improve the soil without me really having to do anything for it. Other things that are in here that are in my soil that I haven't mentioned right now are beneficial mites. So I have a mite in here in my soil that is called Hypoaspis miles, and it's a predatory mite that feeds on thrip pupa and gnat larvae and stuff like that, which I find very necessary because otherwise you end up just getting a bunch of problems, and it's kind of like the police. It just kind of prevents anything from really getting out of control. So I quite like having that in there, but it is in my main soil bin here. One last thing that I add to my soil as well is something called Mosquito Bits. This prevents gnat larvae from getting out of control. It is a bacteria that actually feeds on the gnat larvae. And I found this to be the best way to keep gnats at bay. I used to have an infestation when I was still buying bagged soil, and this took care of that in no time flat after trying many other things. It's actually what started me on making my own soil, is that gnat infestation. It's just trying to get rid of it caused me to make my own soil. And after trying so many other things, I finally came upon the Mosquito Bits, and that just took care of it all. So I'll add a little bit of that in here as well. Just a little bit goes a long way. Generally, what I would recommend, however, how you use this is that you dissolve it in some water, and then that way, just water your plants with it. I just find that gets it all in the soil a lot better than just adding the little granules. But you can also use the granules, just when you're making your soil like I do now, I still will add some granules in there too, just so that it's always in there. And then as I'm using it, I'll still water with the Mosquito Bits as well, just to really ensure that the Mosquito Bits and the bacteria, more specifically, are present in the soil. So I'll show you now my little backup storage for my soil, how I have that set up. Alright, so this is the soil that has been sitting for a while. I just recently added some more banana peels and some Brussels sprout peelings to it. But if I start digging in here, I also watered this yesterday, so it's pretty moist right now. If I just start digging through here, you can see all those things that I added to it. You might be able to see the worms. This might be kind of weird to some people, but I find it to be very beneficial. They just make my job of gardening a lot easier. So I won't disturb them too much, and as you can see, they're still working away at some of these things that are in here. I will only add these food scraps in here if I know I'm not going to use it for a while. Mostly because, you know, it gives them time to break it all down, and it just adds more fertility and more nutrients to my soil. If I'm not going to use it for a while anyway, then you might as well do that. You also want to make sure that you keep your soil pretty moist, because if you don't, you know, that's just going to become dry dust essentially, which is what you buy in the stores a lot of the times. It's just dry dust. It's all dead. There's nothing in it. But if you keep it moist, then the life, the microbiology in your soil can still continue to develop. So I highly recommend that as well. All right. Well, that was pretty much it, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And we will see you in the next one. Tot de volgende keer.